So the next tank we brought in, which jumps ahead a bit, is the infantry tank Mark III, known as the Valentine. Again, there are all sorts of lovely names as to how the Valentine was christened.
Yeah.
They're mostly rubbish. Valentine, again, is from the Latin valens, for valour. So it has a good reason behind its name. And the Valentine was built with a 40mm or 2-pounder gun. The version we're showing you today has the 6-pounder. This was produced later on in the war. And it meant that with the later models, like the sort of Mark VIII and so on, with the 6-pounder gun, you had a tank with quite good hitting power. Now, one of the troubles is that although this tank was designed by Vickers Armstrong, who were renowned for the quality of their tanks, they tended to keep it in production for a lot longer than was good for it. So it was really, as it got later on, being outclassed by more modern tanks. The driver sits in the front on his own in a very narrow cab, and then you have two men in the turret, the commander and the gunner. The commander also acts as the loader, while the gunner aims and fires the gun. Now the next tank in the arena is the M3 Stuart. The Stuart was one of the first American tanks supplied to the British Army under the Lend-Lease Agreement and earlier. And it really, although at first the British were very sniffy about it, they realised that effectively it was a good tank. It had a 37mm gun, which was quite hard-hitting, powered by a radial aircraft engine with a very flexible suspension. This one and a number of others actually came from Brazil, our own exhibits, and it's a Brazilian one, but it's been painted up to resemble a British Stuart cruiser tank from the desert. The name Stuart is after Jeb Stuart, the Confederate cavalry commander, and this was all done at the behest of Winston Churchill. Churchill couldn't understand why we had to call our tanks M3, M4 and that sort of thing. He wanted them named, and he chose the fact that they were named after the Civil War general.
Phone in there for a quick bit of recovery if it doesn't make it round.
Now the next tank coming on is a Panzer III, a German tank from the Second World War. Generally speaking, the German tanks were better finished than our own. They did all welded construction, which was remarkable really, something we were very slow to catch on with. Torsion bar suspension, and it's powered by a Maybach petrol engine. A lot of people think the German tanks were diesel powered. They weren't. They all used Maybach petrol engines. Again, like the American tank, it drives through the transmission at the front, that is the gearbox and so on at the front of the vehicle, and then the drive sprockets at the front, so the adjustable wheel for the track tension is at the back. But the combination of a welded hull and a torsion bar suspension meant that that tank could be adapted, and it grew up quite remarkably. When the first ones were built, they came with a 37mm gun. In the Desert War, they were extended to a 50 and then a long 50mm gun, all without really upsetting the structure of the tank itself. And then towards the end, as they were getting a bit past it, they were fitted with short 75mm guns, which gave them a good close support function. Behind the Panzer III is something really unusual. It's a thing called a Kettenkrad. It was made by NSU, and it's basically a half-track motorcycle. It's got a motorcycle front fork and wheels, and then a set of tracks at the back, like other German half-tracks. They were issued originally for paratroops of the German army, but in fact became so useful they would operate anywhere where wheeled vehicles couldn't go. So they were particularly popular on the Russian front. They take a single driver in British Army service, the American Jeep. But now the Panzer III is coming down our end of the arena. You can see the rack at the back for extra fuel. An interesting thing with the Panzer III, the Germans didn't like putting the wireless set in the turret, which is what we did. So the aerial is on the right-hand side of the hull and usually laid flat because it got in the way of the traversing of the turret. Coming on now is probably one of the most impressive exhibits you'll ever see here at the Tank Museum. It weighs 56 tons, has 100mm thick frontal armour, and uses torsion bar suspension and interleaved road wheels to support the great weight when it's going across country. It's again driven from the front sprockets. The engine, the back is a Maybach V12, a much more powerful one than in the Panzer III, but the same basic unit, driving through an 8-speed pre-selector gearbox at the front and then drive sprockets at the outer ends of that, and has very wide tracks. Because it's so wide and so heavy, when they moved the Tiger by rail, they had to take the tracks off, take the outer set of road wheels off each side and put narrow travelling tracks on so they could climb on a train without wiping out all the line side bits and pieces. So if you ever see a Tiger with the narrower tracks, you'll know why that is. The gun is an 88mm, it's a very high velocity weapon and is very similar to the 88mm flat gun. It's absolutely devastating. And although the Germans only built about 1,300 of them in all, you can see why most Allied crews were very nervous of them, and rightly so. There are instances of British and American tanks taking out Tigers. In fact, we had a chap who used to come here regularly who, in a Sherman Firefly, knocked out 3 Tigers, but that would be the exception. Normally it was the Tiger that had the winning hand and knocked out anything at ranges that we couldn't fight back at. But the Tiger is really a very, very impressive vehicle. It's not very heavy, but quite a sight to see. It's got a power-operated traverse to the turret. Requires a crew of 5, that's 3 men in the turret and 2 in the hull, 1 the driver in the hull, and to his right would be a man operating the hull machine gun and operating the radio. But just watching that suspension is quite something. You can see how it churns up the mud and the suspension reacts to the bumpy ground. Now he's changed up just to give it a bit more revs, a bit more power. He's going to come right round in front of us here now, which is quite something to see. In fact, it makes such a nice noise. I'll let you have a listen to it without me waffling on for a while.